Welcome to this Autism Ontario webinar, Gender Diversity and Autism, Understanding the Connection, with Gwynne and Stephanie Moeser. My name is Matthew Lay, and as always, I will be your host. On these webinars, as you know, our job is to help educate and inform. And so throughout the presentation today, I will be looking to get answers to your questions. To submit a question, you can do so using the Ask Question button located on the bottom of the webinar interface. Those will come to me, and I will find the breaks and times to effectively ask those questions and try and get you answers. There's a lot of you out there today, a lot of interest in this topic, and so we may not get to all of the questions live on the webinar. With that said, we always do our best to try and get back to you afterwards if we aren't able to get to them live. A few other points. This presentation does have a PowerPoint. It's going to help inform our discussion. You can go ahead and access the resource panel where you'll get some helpful links and information about the topic today, as well as you can download the PowerPoint presentation. And finally, if you have any issues, you can go ahead and click the help button. Now, I got a few other things that I need to get out of the way before we get started. First off, the opinions reflected in this webinar are those of the speakers and presenters and do not necessarily reflect Autism Ontario's views. Please note that Autism Ontario does not endorse any specific therapy, product, treatment, strategy, opinions, or service or individual. What we do, however, endorse is your right to information. Autism Ontario strongly believes that it is important to do your own research and make your own informed decisions. When it comes to language, I want to review the use of language during this presentation. Autism means different things to everyone. Medical professionals, researchers, providers may use one term, while individuals or their family may refer to themselves or their family member slightly differently. The different terms you'll hear being used today describe autism as either a person-first perspective, example, person with autism, or identity-first label, autistic person. Person-first language reflects the idea that autism can be separated from the person and doesn't define them, similar to phrases such as living with autism. Well, identity-first language reflects the belief that being autistic is an important part of a person's identity and cannot be separated. To respect both these preferences, we will be using terms interchangeably throughout this workshop, and will respect the label that you personally choose to use as well. Pull that up. So I want to start with a first timer. The first time that she's been with us on the Autism Ontario desk. Gwynne, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Sorry. Anna, you know what? Rather than me saying anything about this, you've got a lot of experience. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what your experience is and what brings you to this webinar today?
Absolutely, Matt. Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you to Autism Ontario and to everyone here on the webinar for expressing interest in this topic. I have worked for many, many years in both health and education sectors, and I've worked a lot with youth. And over the years, I definitely recognized that there's more and more kids identifying as trans and non-binary, and more kids identifying an intersectional identity as both neurodivergent or autistic and trans and non-binary. So for me, doing some more research and understanding the interconnection between these identities was really important. And it's something I identify as well. So my pronouns are they and them. I identify as a non-binary, queer, neurodivergent parent, and as well as many other things. And I also think it's an interesting time because this is the first time we've had non-binary and trans indicated in our national census, and we found that there was a lot of people, over 100,000, who identified themselves as trans or non-binary, which I think is actually lowballing. But for the first time being identified in a census, we can recognize that we're seeing more and more folks who are openly identifying as trans and non-binary, and that is about, if we work it out, it's 0.33% of the population, or 1 in 300 folks. So, I think this is a time and it's important to be talking about these identities and especially how they intersect with autism.
Excellent, excellent. And our other panelists, this is not your first time with us. Stephanie, can you talk a little bit about your experience and what brings you to this webinar panel today?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm pleased to be back presenting with Autism Ontario again. I've had experience. Matt and I met many, many years ago now. We met in a webinar format before webinar formats were were the thing of the day. Yeah, so I am a social worker living and working in the Peterborough, Kawartha Lakes area. I am a neurotypical person and I'm cisgendered, so my pronouns are she and her. And I have worked with autistic youth and adults for many, many years, counseling, providing support to folks and their caregivers. I also do a lot of work with youth in the post-secondary environment, so college and university students. And similar to Anya, so I've been working with the neurodivergent community for years. And over the last few years, more and more conversation around gender has appeared in my conversations with youth and with adults and with children as well. Parents have had questions. I feel quite privileged that youth and adults have sort of trusted me with their questions. And Anya and I have gotten to know each other a bit over the years and had some interesting conversations about the overlaps in the work that they do, in the work that I do. And yeah, the research we'll get to in a second supports that overlap. So Anya and I sort of got together and had some discussions about how our shared experience, I am not autistic, but shared experience in working in the community diverge nicely in order to have this conversation. So that's sort of how this came to be.
Diverged and converged to this moment. Well, with the interest in the topic, I don't think that it's any surprise that this is an important topic to be discussing at this time. But talk to me just a little bit about why you believe this is an important topic right now and why we need to be sharing this type of information with our community at Autism Ontario.
For sure. So a little bit what I mentioned about the research, there's some more and more research is coming out to support what clinicians, support people, parents, autistic folks have been seeing. So kind of as is not unusual, the research is kind of coming behind after what we've been seeing, and sort of supports what we've been seeing. So some of the research says that people who don't identify as the sex they were assigned at birth are 3 to 6 times more likely to be autistic than cisgendered people. And so for those, there's going to be some terms that may be new to folks here. So essentially what cisgendered means is that the gender identity that somebody has doesn't correspond to the sex they were assigned at birth. So for cisgender people, it does assign. And so we are seeing, 3 to 6 more times autistic people are more likely to be part of this community. And on the flip side, so in the research with the gender diverse community, they're seeing similar things. So gender diverse folks are more likely to be autistic than cisgender people. I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add to that, Anya?
Nope, that's great.
Okay. So you've given us a good basis for, the importance and why for this community, but there's a little bit more to the story, and it's important, especially within this topic, that we set some baselines for how we're going to be talking about things. You've already done a little bit of that. Thank you, Stephanie. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to you to go through a bit of a presentation that you put together to help sort of get things started before we move to more of a discussion format. Now, for my audience, that doesn't mean you don't submit your questions. Submit your questions, and from I'll find the breaks. I'll make sure that I find the time to get those questions answered. So Stephanie, over to you. Let's talk a little bit about, the basis of this, the topics and the like.
So as I mentioned, there may be some language and terminology that may be new to parents and caregivers. I think there's also a number of professionals, which is wonderful, on today's webinar. So we'll do our best to define words, define language, just to give people, to widen vocabulary. We also, I think it will be mentioned later, vocabulary, language, pronouns, what people identify, how people identify is very, very important, but it's not that. What's most important is kind of the openness to hear and to care and to be open to questions and support to your child. But yes, we will be doing our best to define language and terminology. I know at the beginning, Matt talked about language and language within the autistic community. Not surprising, given the title. We lean towards identity first language. The reason for that is because that's most of what autistic folks are preferring. And when I work with youth, mostly most people prefer identity first language. So that's most of what we'll be using. Another thing we'll be talking about is masking. So masking, which I'll go into more detail after Anya speaks about gender expression, but most masking, some people are familiar with. I've had some autistic folks say to me, "Can you please clarify? We are all physically masking a lot these days with masks." So it gets confusing sometimes in this era of COVID. But what I mean by masking here is many autistic people talk about the pressure, the societal pressure, or from family or other people to appear neurotypical. And that often what happens is folks will observe other people, will learn from others about how to behave within the world. And this sometimes often goes against one's natural inclination and can take a real toll. And so it's really important that we talk about this and that this is made aware, so folks can have spaces, places, supports where somebody can be their neurodivergent, lovely, amazing selves. But we're also seeing that this also likely, and not in all cases, but in some cases, pertains to gender identity. When folks are feeling societal's pressure that gender should mean a specific thing, that somebody's expression should be something. And sometimes this goes counter what somebody may internally feel. And some of these masking challenges and pressures may come up around gender as well. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, because it really can be exhausting for folks and can take a toll. And I think that really needs to be, people need to be aware of that and aware of how we can create spaces where people, if they so wish, can unmask in safe spaces. And hopefully in the larger public, that would be the overall goal. And of course, families are here, which is wonderful. That's a primary way of showing support right there. But we'll be discussing in the time that we have emotions that could come up for families, questions that families may have, caregivers may have about how to best support their children. And how to kind of, won't get a lot of depth, but how to, support themselves as they're going through this process. Okay, should we go on to the next slide then? There we go.
Yeah, I'm happy to take it from here, Stephanie. So I actually do want to take a moment just to circle back to recognize, I'm going to tie this all in together. So how we understand gender is very much related to colonization and Western ideologies. So I think it is important for us to express our gratitude for First Nations people across Turtle Island for their care and teachings about the land, the water, the animals, and all our relations, and to recognize our role and also the challenges and the impacts that colonization continues to bring us with, or to task us with. And one of those is actually gender. So this idea, sometimes people have this idea of like, oh, now this is all new, this trans and non-binary stuff is all new. Actually, in Indigenous communities, Two-Spirit people, which were folks that were seen to have both masculine and feminine energy, or like an identity, were highly revered. And people were not kicked out of their communities or ostracized or discriminated against because of their difference. They were seen to have a gift from the Creator. And Two-Spirit people in particular, a community was seen to be in balance. So I want to start there and recognize that, and as part of our acknowledgement to Indigenous communities, and it was colonization that brought with it these ideas around what gender roles were and what people were to look like. So for years and years, folks believed that gender was whatever your sex was. So an assigned sex is basically what a doctor, you come out and the doctor says, okay, you're innie, outie, we don't know. Like basically they make an assignment that's not hormonally or chromosomally fact checked. Basically, it's just a look about what that child sex is. And for years and years, people believed that gender was the assigned sex. So what we understand though is gender is socially and politically constructed. It's informed, it changes over time. I mean, we can think back to there was a point in history where men wore high heels and makeup and powdered wigs and perfume, right? Like we have these ideas of what gender is, but it actually transitions over time based on the social and political information that we have and the norms that we adhere to. Acceptance and affirmation are more important. So when we're working with a child, or our child is coming to us with a different experience of their gender, we don't necessarily need to understand all of the terms or all of the, how we got here. It's more important to offer that child affirmation and acceptance, similar to what we do when our child identifies as autistic or when our child has been seen to be autistic. How are we looking to understand the reality of our child, and especially with gender, something that seems like so concrete when we actually know it to be much more malleable. So autism intersects with gender identity in different ways, some of which we're talking about today. But this idea of that how someone expresses their autism, like being autistic, and how someone expresses gender can be a variety of ways. So while Stephanie and I are going to talk to some of the examples or experiences that we might have seen, there's no cookie cutter example of anyone who might experience these intersecting identities. We could go on to the next slide. So I want to break it down, because for some folks, even just hearing that assigned sex and gender are not the same might be a surprise, because so much of our society is built on this binary system of you're male or you're female, and along with that, you identify as man or as woman. So gender identity is different than our assigned sex in the sense that it is an internal idea or feeling or sense of self, of being a man or a woman, neither or both along a continuum. And I'm going to take a guess that most people here on the call, that was not how gender was described to you, or not how you experienced it as a young person growing up. And that's often where our ideas around gender and gender roles and expectations come from, is kind of growing up and having these, kind of soaking up the ideas that we see, or soaking up the information that we have about these things. So, if we understand gender as a continuum, and we understand it as an internal and individual experience, that has a very different take on it than as what your body is. And our gender identity is not always visible to other people. It might even be confusing to ourselves, especially if I grow up and everyone who I depend on to take care of me identifies to me as one thing and tells me I'm one thing. That can cause a tension between everyone I know and love and trust tells me I'm a girl, but I don't feel like that. So there's already a bit of a tension that can happen around what's normal and what I'm supposed to be. Right? You can start to see where this might start to like overlap with the experience of someone who's autistic. So then gender expression is the way that we choose to signal or let people know about our gender. And that could be how we walk, talk, how we wear our hair, the clothes that we choose to wear. So I might know my gender identity, but I might not be able to express it. And especially young people who don't have autonomy around their own, what they choose to wear. It's also about safety. I might not feel like I'm safe to wear the things I want to wear, or I might experience like pushback when I say I want to wear these things, and sometimes for parents too, that comes from a place of wanting our children to be safe. Well, I don't want you to wear that to school because I don't want you to get made fun of. And especially if we have an intersection with any other identity that might be marginalized, we're going to kind of double down on that protection, right? So gender expression is how we choose to signal our gender to others, but it's not always something that we're able to do authentically. And then the last piece of this is our body and genetics and how our body presents itself and how society looks at the body and genders it, right? So this idea of like, well, your body looks like a girl, you must identify as a girl, and then how we are treated based on basically our body and our bodies in space and time. And that can be very politicized as we know. So we can move on to the next slide. So when someone identifies as trans or non-binary, and just to clarify again, as Stephanie said, transgender is generally, and this is an umbrella terminology, but someone whose gender identity, so how they see themselves or how they express themselves, is different than the sex they were assigned at birth. So that's a lot of gray area in there as well, right? So it's quite fluid. So sometimes someone can have such an adverse experience in that tension that it's called gender dysphoria. And this is actually in the Diagnostic Manual of Mental Illness, which is a bit of a challenge because, then we're saying that people who have this experience are also mentally ill. So now we're adding another marginalization to this piece. However, there are experiences where young people experience such discomfort that they actually try to harm themselves, or they have, they act out in ways that are very, very traumatic and very, they have such distress. So this is a fundamental unease and dissatisfaction with one's assigned sex at birth, which can result in anxiety, restlessness, and other symptoms. And we can see this actually sometimes increase as people reach puberty, as those hormones shift and people start to develop parts of their body in a way that gives them a lot of distress. For example, if I feel that I am a boy and I reach menses and I start to bleed, that is hugely traumatic. That is a traumatic experience that I'm having because of dysphoria. So often when we talk about this, it's in the negative, like we talk about gender dysphoria, and that's the only thing that kind of gets discussed in terms of trans, how to identify transness. But there's this other beautiful piece called gender euphoria. So this is a feeling or state of intense excitement or happiness regarding one's gender. So this could include, like, all of a sudden I find a piece of clothing that makes me feel great, or I get to get my hair cut and I see myself as the self that I imagine myself to be. And that is like the positive spin on this, right? Is like, how do we find ourselves and our gender in a way that is actually affirming for ourselves and really rewarding? And so sometimes what can happen, though, is someone can have that euphoria and have that moment, but it's actually combated by someone, someone who's worried about us having that euphoric moment around our haircut. So I want to send it back to Stephanie to kind of draw that relation to the autistic experience as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Anya. I think some parents ask, well, what if this is just a special interest? What if this is, if somebody's sort of real focus, if this is what it is, and it's not about gender diversity. And I think it's important to look at the gender euphoria in that experience as if somebody does sort of delve really into learning more about gender diversity, learning more about their experience, that this, we know autistic folks, this is generalization, but information, people like information. And sometimes information helps to ground somebody, helps somebody feel more grounded in what they may be feeling. I also think it's really important, Anya mentioned, gender dysphoria. We know autistic folks sometimes have a hard time with the relationship to their body in general. And sometimes putting words to emotions, feelings to emotions, that connection is very difficult. So I think it's really important to recognize that some young folks may feel this discomfort or may feel this anxiety and restlessness, but not be able to put words to it as easily, not be able to put emotions to it, and could be trying to figure it out themselves. And part of that sort of special interest or research could be helping to give them information, feel more grounded, language, community, all of those pieces. And the gender euphoria, of finding that, of researching hairstyles, researching clothes, researching all those pieces, really helps to inform somebody, to give language, to feel all those wonderful pieces of being able to express themselves in a way that's helpful. I also think, though, and Anya, feel free to jump in here, of course, if you want to. There are a number of autistic folks where gender actually doesn't mean anything, if that makes sense. It is like gender, I saw a quote this morning as I was sort of prepping by an autistic person who said, like, I don't feel like a gender. And so that whole construct, that whole construct doesn't even kind of make sense. So the idea of what gender expression is, or this idea of having to wear clothes, and clothes don't have a gender, but the idea of having to wear clothes or do something that makes somebody align with their own internal identity, some families have a hard time being like, but they don't seem to have interest in, expressing themselves in a different way. And so I think, that's okay. Not everybody is going to want to have a gender expression that is stereotyped in some sort of way. Anya, did you want to add more to that? I saw you getting happy flappy there.
Just that was my experience growing up, was that there was these, and I think I've told you this story, Stephanie, but there was this time when all of a sudden I started hearing young ladies don't do this and young ladies don't do this, and all of a sudden I was getting clothes put out on my bed that were totally not comfortable. Like, I was like, why do you want me to wear this? And it was very confusing for me because I did not see myself as any of these things, and it actually took me a whole lifetime to kind of come back around to feeling a validation in that I could be neither of these things, or I could just be my own identity in these things. Because to me, actually, as much as I do this work around gender, part of it is because I don't quite understand it. Like, I understand it theoretically, but I don't understand it in my own lived body, where I felt that gender was something that was constantly imposed on me, not something I authentically felt about myself. So thanks for that. And I think, Matt, I think we have a video that we're going to queue up.
Yeah, we are. So everybody, we're going to play this video and then we'll be right back. And I plan on getting to some of your questions before we move on with the presentation. So if you got new ones, feel free to enter them, and we will be we'll be right back, everyone.
Can I before we go to the video, just if I can just say a few pieces why I picked it. So this video is from an amazing website called Aid Canada, which is really driven by autistic folks and folks with intellectual disabilities. And this is a presentation that I believe is referenced in the reference list, a presentation that's moderated similar to this, with two folks who have done a lot of work in gender and autism. And this is their question and answer portion, of which we'll be getting into, but their question and answer portion. I really like this video because it really highlights this clip, I think, that's being shown now. It highlights more the importance. The pronouns, yes, are important, and respecting people's names and pronouns, but the aspect of being open and asking, and really that's the primary piece. And it's just a very quick clip. So thanks, Matt.
And with that, we'll roll the video.
Might not be. So question is, thank you very much for your talk. My sibling has recently shared that their pronouns are they, she. I'm wondering if the order of the pronouns is significant. In other words, is the first pronoun the one to use more often, or is this a personal preference? Thank you.
Oh, that is a good question. I'm actually not sure because I don't know the person in question. And it may just be that that's how they describe their pronouns. They might say she, they another time, or it might be more significant that they is be used more often than she. My thinking would be just to ask the person. That's probably the best approach, just respectfully say, well, is it meaningful that they is before she? Would you prefer to be called they most of the time? Are there situations in which you wouldn't? And just ask the person. I think that's perfectly respectful and quite thoughtful.
Maybe comment just a little bit on that. I think you set it up pretty well, but what, thing that stood out to me beyond the answer was the pause at the start. And that, this idea that, when it comes to some of the questions that we're going to be getting into, it's hard without knowing the individual. On this desk, we often say, if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism, but now we're talking about even more intersections. So talk to me a little bit, why you picked that video and what take from it while I queue up some questions from our audience.
I can speak to the answer, if that's okay, Stephanie.
Yes, of course.
So I think generally, and why I believe Stephanie chose this clip, is that we grow up in a society that tells us we know what gender is, so it can feel really vulnerable and really uncomfortable. Especially with our own children sometimes, who we brought into the world and we're like, I know who you are, to actually step back and say, and listen and say, oh, okay, how should I refer to you? Like that feels really weird because we think we have this insider trader knowledge on our own kids, right? And when they identify something that feels maybe a bit scary to us because we don't understand it, or we feel worried for them, or we feel like maybe it's not true, that we have a hesitancy to put up a boundary or to kind of push back. And I think what Yen is referring to is just this idea of when we're not sure, sometimes the best thing to do is just be like, okay, well, this is new to me. How could I say this differently? Or how would you like me to refer to you? And sometimes letting that can be really uncomfortable for us because it's not something we're used to. Even identifying our pronouns in a group is feeling a bit weird, for people. And it's not all about pronouns. It's not about the pronoun. What it is I see you and I hear you, and I'm going to do the best I can to be respectful to what you're telling me about yourself. And I know that seems weird because the pronoun is what? She, he, they. It's a small thing, but it means a lot when you say something like, this is how I identify, and someone says, okay, I hear that. It's new for me, but I'm going to work on that. That piece of affirmation is huge, especially when it's our children, or if we're a service provider and we want to build some rapport or some comfortability with the person we're providing services to.
Well, as a father of a 15-year-old, I assure you, we don't know our children and anymore like we thought we did. And we lose that inside track quite quickly. Although my son identifies as LGBTQ, what I can say about the community in which he's in is that as a parent, my lack of knowledge on the subject going in, before I even knew that that's how he identified, affected my relationship with my son and the way I was able to interact with him, because he was looking at me like, not like a very progressive father. Like, I was making mistakes and not even making mistakes in language, but I do think that he was right in that I may not have tried hard enough to get my head around it early enough. Whereas it was happening early in his life at, 11, 12, these conversations were happening in the school and the like. Okay, I'm going to go to some questions from our audience. I want to start with, you might get to this a bit later, but I think it's important based around some of the stuff I heard earlier, and that is, how can we support specifically autistic youth who have several identities experiencing intersecting marginalization? Any pointers there?
I can start. It was interesting. If anybody would like to, I'm going to circle back to the video we just showed, because Yen speaks about it well. Yen actually happens to also have schizophrenia and autism, and so lots of intersectionalities. And again, Anya, jump in when you want to. I think in terms of intersectionalities, one, Matt, you talked about education. I think, as parents, especially if the intersectionalities aren't visible, as parents, it's really important to educate ourselves, to find, and also where helpful, to find community, help our children find community. I know, one of the supports in the community here is a group, Rainbow Youth Group, and I know a lot of folks that I've worked with who've been within that group have found people who are also parts of that multiple intersectionality. We do know, I don't know the stats, I don't think it's important, but we do know, people who are most at risk for isolation and violence, unfortunately, are people of color who are trans and who also have disabilities. Like, we know that intersectionality, that we need to be really, really open to finding supports. I think these places of conversation, I think is a really important place to start, and to recognizing that. I think what we really wanted to hone in on and make sure we focus on is, as parents, as caregivers, as professionals, as teachers, whoever else is here, is openness to have conversations and to say to our kids, the kids we support, kids we work with, and Matt, you kind of alluded to this with your experience as a parent, is being open to saying, how can I support you? What can I do to be helpful? Asking those questions so that we're able to know how to best support our kids, and also volunteering information so our kids don't have to be the ones to do all the work all the time. Do you want to add to that, Anya?
Yeah, I think there are great resources out there. I think it is important for parents to do their own work and to find their own supports. So one of the things, I recently left the sector I was working in, and one of the things I realized was there was a huge gap in support for parents of gender and gender diverse, trans, non-binary youth in particular. And so far, every parent group, so I started a coaching website, but every parent I've talked to, their child has been intersectional in terms of autism. So and I don't know if that's just luck of the draw or what, but a couple I actually were like, I think autism is the number one issue that you as a parent need support about, and I referred them over to Stephanie. But interestingly enough, like, I think that parents, I mean, oh my gosh, we have these children, we don't get a manual, we don't get a template, and then if there's anything like marginalized or different about them, then we're kind of like going, okay, well, how much of this is, what do I need to learn, and how do I support them? And there's a lot of internalizing around our parenting that can happen from that when we don't have support. I also want to recognize that we are all intersectional. We are not And none of us here on the call are singly one thing. And the thing is that when we talk about intersectionality, often it's about what is marginalized and what's different about us. But if we can also kind of identify with ourselves, and I call it adult amnesia, sometimes we forget what it's like to be a young person trying to figure themselves out. And what if the figuring out is actually pushing back against a lot of society's constructs? Like, that's a big weight for an 11-year-old to take on their shoulders, let alone a 50-year-old, right? So, I think that we have to recognize context. We have to recognize that, sure, our kid might bring us some information that a few weeks later has changed. But that's part of understanding who they are. And so, just again, reminding us we're all intersectional, but some of these intersections get stereotyped or positioned in a certain way that makes it hard to our kids. But I think sometimes if we can go back and remember that bad haircut and the goth makeup we wore, we might understand that there are moments that we ourselves were trying to identify as something, and we weren't quite sure what that was. But what we know we needed was for someone to say, "You're good. You're okay. I love you." That kind of.
And as I don't usually have much to add, but as someone who went through it, being able to get over yourself, that may be the first time that you're not coming to the conversation with more information than your child, and you are not the call it the voice of knowledge in this position. You got to get over that hurdle first. And the other thing that I will recommend before moving on is just that I tried to read. I am not by trade a social worker. I am not used to reading a lot of, I have an undergrad and that's it. I found a lot of the scholarly articles that you find online harder to get my head around. And I found a couple great, and there's a bunch of them, TED Talks that helped me understand it. They simplified it and they were absolutely great. Not saying that I'm there, but it was enough for me anyways to have a vocabulary to start a conversation in a better way. And I think that went a long way with my son, and I'm sure it will with a lot of others.
And can I add to that just quickly? So as many people on the call may know, autism and autistic advocates are very active on social media. And there's some really great, we talk about learning and TED Talks and those sorts of things, but also if you're interested in learning from folks with lived experience. So I'll talk about Yen Perkis there. So Yen is very active online with lots of great stuff. And there's a number of other people too. And so, hearing about people who've been through who've journeyed and have some good feedback was lots of fantastic information around that. And I think,
that's interesting because there's a question here specifically about the places for resources for those living with autism and this intersectionality. So specifically, you mentioned connecting with those with lived experience online. Clearly, there's some information. Autism Ontario is always a wealth of information and a great place to learn. Are there any other specific places that you would recommend people go for this intersection to get resources on it?
As I mentioned, the Aid Canada, just where where this video is from, also has a whole section as well. We have a list of resources. I know just in general, not specifically about autism, but the information applies. Rainbow Health here in Ontario has some really great resources, and I know Anya, you're familiar with some. Well, and Anya also, I will plug Anya for them. Anya has started, has a coaching business because they were seeing. I don't mean to speak for you, but because they were supporting youth, but realizing the parents. The parents had so many questions. The parents really needed support. So there are more people doing this important work. Sorry if you want to add to that, Anya.
There is it's not specific to autistic realities, but it's called Families in Transition, and it's a really great resource just around understanding gender diversity in our kids, and as a parent and as a family, what might be some of the myths and misconceptions, and how might you support. I think that we don't need to separate these things. I mean, I think if we understand more about gender identity, if that's something our kid is identifying, then it's not necessarily like I think we will start to see more and more resources that actually overlap. I was a couple of years ago, just pre-COVID, I was at a conference in Montreal, specifically all around trans health, and there was no less than 3 sessions that were talked about the overlap of these identities. So I think we will start to see more and more resources, but right now we're kind of in that beginning phase of getting and as Matt identified, there can be lots of scholarly stuff out there, but in terms of really tangible, pragmatic resources for parents, not as much that talk to the intersection. That's why we're having this conversation today. But I think something like families in transition, if you can kind of get your head around that piece, I think that it's really, the end of the day, it's honestly about leaning into that discomfort and knowing that, hey, my kid is telling me something that I don't know about, and looking to them not to be the only experience, but if it's our kid and we know that every kid is going to have, or every person, or every autistic person, or every queer or trans non-binary person is going to have their own journey, then that's the journey I want to focus on. So I can get these resources, but really I want to say, hey kid, wow, this is new information to me. Let me take a breath and what can I do? What do I need to do? What do I need to learn? Or to help you or to support you in this. That is going to mean more than having any big information sort of paper or anything like that, I think. So, I mean, I think we can give you resources on our list. I would say that Families in Transition Guide is amazing. I think I included a PDF, but I think it's really about recognizing that you might not find one resource that fits all of the things that you need to know.
And remember the skills experience that you've learned, or the resources that you have for things like communication. You have a question, we're not going to get to it right now because we have to get into this lightning round about a child with challenges in communication, looking at how to come out. Well, you have skills, you have resources for communication and doing that. And those will apply here. This is not, this is a part of life. It's not, something that needs to be done in a different way. And once you get more comfortable with yourself, then it'll be much easier for you to support them in that. Okay, so we've got just over 10 minutes to go, and we've got a few important questions that we want to get through. On this one, I will start with Stephanie. How do I support my child with respect to their authentic self? First off, what does authentic self mean, and how do I support them in that?
Well, and I think we'll circle back that it's sort of the conversation we've been having throughout is, many people here on the call, I'm assuming most people here on the call, recognize their child, the person that they're living with or caring for or supporting, as being autistic. So, and I like how Matt, that you mentioned earlier about communication. So you've probably learned about your child through that autistic lens, and authenticity, from my perception, is where somebody's able to unmask, where somebody's able to be themselves, to be comfortable in being themselves, to figure themselves out, to take that space. And, as Anya and I have been talking about, much of that is asking questions, affirming people's experiences, feelings, emotions. I do want to make sure that me and Anya have been talking about this, obviously, leading up to the presentation. And I think, I hope you're not putting you on the spot here, Anya, but I really liked, and it kind of made me sticking down to what if I make a mistake or if this is a phase. But around the authenticity, you talked about pacing, and that as a child is sort of coming to be who they are, about that they don't have to drive the pace. I don't know, you worded it so well, and maybe you can talk to that, Anya.
So Sometimes I don't remember what I said, but I'm glad it was. Yeah, so I can speak to that. Sometimes, yeah, and we know this with kids, and I would say especially when our kids are really excited about something, or they're really like focused in on this thing, and they're so excited to tell you about it, and they want it to all happen now, and you know, I need to go to the mall, I need to get all new clothes, and I want to find out about hormones, and I want to cut my hair, and it's like, whoa, okay. So sometimes we can get caught up in that because we're so intent on supporting our kid that we feel like we don't want to say no, because it's like, and sometimes that, and this is a hard one to kind of find that balance in, but it's like that pace, we don't need to let them set the pace. We can lean in and help understand, but we can also say, hey, we're going to put the brakes on a little bit here, you know, and let's find some common ground, and let's find some ways that we are not just racing off, because the social transition of folks is so important. And sometimes, because of the way that the media represents trans identities in particular, there's this idea that I need to do all these things to be this identity. I need to change my body. I need to change everything about myself. I need to change my name. I need to do it. And maybe some of those things are going to be important. You know, being identified as a name that really makes me feel upset all the time is probably something that we can easily change. And that is part of social transition. Having, getting support for yourself as a parent to support your kid is part of the social transition part. And so we want to kind of slow that down sometimes, not to negate it at all, and not to say you don't know yet, or you're too young, or you need to wait for this, but to say, whew, okay, we're on this journey together. Let's like pace ourselves a little bit. Let's get our feet under us. Let's understand, like, let's, you know, figure out how we're going to talk to people, who we want to know, who we want to let know about this information before we start researching hormones, or before we start looking at surgeons, right? Because sometimes what happens is the confidence that people gain from being affirmed for who they are actually slows down, or they start to go, hey, maybe I don't want to do all of this stuff to my body, because now people see me for who I am, and I'm actually feeling really great about it. And maybe they will want to do those things, but it doesn't have to happen all as one package, right? This is a path. This is a journey that we're on with our kids, or a journey that we are supporting as a service provider. And, you know, to recognize that we want to affirm them, but we also don't need to let them set the pace. So thanks.
Kind of I wanted to bring that piece up there around the authentic self, because I think when parents are wanting to really support their children, sometimes they get caught up in the pace and the speed. And I think, you know, for autistic folks who are really excited too, sometimes slowing it down for them is also helpful, you know, to give that grounding, to give that space, to give that time is helpful. So sorry for putting you on the spot, but I wanted to make sure that you speak to it so well.
So, you know, I'll often be in a conversation about social matters or the like, and then my 15-year-old will go to adjourn to his room for the evening on a Friday, you know, listen to music, talk to his friends, whatever it might be. And I look at my fiance and say, was that okay what I said? Like, did I make a mistake? Like, I thought I nailed that one, you know? So what happens when we do? What happens if we make a mistake? You know, it's not often that as parents, we always acknowledge that when it is that we do. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to acknowledge too. I don't think Anya and I said this at the beginning, that we are also both parents. I'm a parent of a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old, and we're going to make mistakes. And I think, you know, you speak to that, Matt, is as parents, we're going to make mistakes. I think acknowledging that and letting our children know that we're learning with them, and that we're learning, and that openness to not get too defensive, but you know, that pacing, as well as Anya spoke about, is recognizing that you're learning as you go, and I don't think you need to get, you know, if mistake with a pronoun, a mistake with a name, obviously that's really important to somebody, as Anya said, to be seen. I think you acknowledge it. You don't have to belabor it too much. Acknowledge it and plan to, to make an intention to rectify that. Anya?
I can guarantee 100%, and I don't guarantee 100% of anything, that you will make a mistake.
Yeah.
It's going to happen.
Right.
Whether you're a service provider, a parent, whatever, it's going to happen. And I think a big piece, and this is a learning that I've just over the last few years have learned myself. We have a tendency when we make a mistake to say, "Oh, I'm sorry," and then to explain why. Not actually helpful, especially not helpful for a young person that may feel some sort of responsibility. And kids sometimes overdevelop their responsibility for the emotional state of their parent. Like they're already aware that they're bringing something to you that could be hard. So when we're like, "Oh, sorry, it's just that, all the pictures of you as a kid or as a girl," and not helpful. So what I've learned is to say, "Thank you. Thank you." So instead of saying sorry, we say, "Thank you. I will try to remember," and find ways that help yourself to remember, whether that's writing something. Maybe you make it fun, and every time you misgender your kid, you put $1 in a jar, kind of like a swear jar, and then that money gets used to, go out together or buy something that's gender affirming for your kid, right? Like something that, like, let's take some of the weight off of this and be like, okay, I'm learning, you're experiencing, we're doing this together. And to say, but my biggest thing is to say thank you and not sorry, because that means it's just such a different take on it. And you're actually affirming your kid by saying, "Thank you, you're right. I need to remember that."
Yeah, it's a huge difference because we're also Canadian, so sorry is the first thing that comes out of our mouth, right? So, because I often say it, I'm an old man is what I say, and then correct myself, and then kind of move on with the conversation is one of mine. So this next question, I'll ask you, Anya, to start. What if this is a phase?
Great. The mood has phases. They're all valid. We're kids, whether they're autistic, whether they're queer, whether they're trans or non-binary, we all go through phases. Everyone here went through many phases to figure out who you are. A phase is just a figuring out period. And, as we journey through our lives, we're going to go through lots of phases. And the problem is that sometimes society weights certain types of phases more than others. If your kid identifies in a particular way, and this is why that pacing, I think, is important, they learn more from us if we say, "No, you're not." They learn that we say, "I'll love you no matter what." But when a kid comes to us in a phase that we don't understand or we fear, the information, whether or not that phase is something that continues, or whether or not that identity is something that continues for them, what they learn when we negate it or as just a phase, or we say, "Oh, you're going to grow out of this," or blah, blah, we tell them something about it, is that thing about "I'll love you no matter what" is not actually, we know it's true. We're just afraid, right? So what they take away from that is "Oh, you'll love me, but not I love you and," right? Mm-hmm. And that is a big difference. I love you and I'm really confused by this, as opposed I love you, but I don't think this is really who you are, right? The difference is so huge. And I think especially when, we have kids with intersections and around communication, it's they will take those words and take them very, very specifically, and maybe even obsess a little bit about how you said that and the way that you said that. And some of that black and white thinking can come into play, right? So I think that our kids are always going to go through phases. I have an 18-year-old, and I can't even tell you the number of different ways that she might have identified or talked about what she wants to do. But if we push back against it, it creates a tension. And I think it's more important to just accept that this is a new learning. And even if it's one that we're challenged by, if we lean into it, then that's going to make a difference around that.
Stephanie, last question on this. Should I tell others?
Yeah, I put this question here because it's come up for a few people that I've worked with. I think, and again, I think in my experience anyway, some parents, caregivers, want to, feel like it will be too difficult for their child to tell others, or that they think that their intention is positive to fill in other family members, to fill in other people. So individuals don't need to carry that quote unquote burden of doing that. We know sometimes for autistic folks, communication is difficult. Difficult communication that has emotions are difficult. But what's really important is that we respect our children, what they're asking, and respect privacy as well. It's an individual journey for folks, for sure. Helping your child, asking what they want, who they want to know, when they want to know. If they want to tell people new pronouns, new names, that's, we can support our children in having those conversations, but we need to protect their privacy and know that that's really important. That trust, that relationship is important. Doesn't mean you can't help them. Doesn't mean that you can't be part of the conversation. Doesn't mean that should they ask you to maybe have that conversation with somebody, maybe that's too difficult. But I think that doesn't negate getting your own support, maybe in different, from different places, and not your own family if your child's not ready for that. Anya,
This is in many cases one of the first adult things, if you will, that your child is going to be talking about. And it's important to remember that regardless of their age, that it's theirs and not yours. It's different than talking about the hockey team that they just quit or signed up for, or whatever it might be. We've gone over just a little bit. So for our audience members who need to go, we didn't get to all your questions. This conversation was great. We're probably going to have to do it again sometime very soon. We will aspire to get you your answers back. Before you leave, please complete the feedback survey. The more information we get, the better we can put on these sessions we can put on, and we know what topics to address and the like. And finally, if you want to come back and check it out again, or if you know somebody who would find benefit in this webinar, it'll be recorded, available on demand online at the Autism Ontario website tomorrow. Pass along to your friends, family ones, anyone who's there. The more people that come through the program, the more webinars we can put on. Before we go, though, I want to thank both of you guys. I want to leave you with sort of your moment of Zen. If there's one thing that you hope our audience walks away from, or some parting words you'd like to leave for our audience, what would that be? Anya, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Stephanie.
I feel I've said most of the things I want to. I think I just want to recognize that parenting is hard. It's hard work. And it can be harder when we feel out of our depth and we feel alone in it and we feel fearful. So I just want to put out there that there are supports, and to not feel afraid to ask for that. You're not expected to do this alone, and to know everything about how to support your child. I think, when your child shares this kind of information with you, to look at it as a gift, to be honored by the fact that they've shared this with you, whether or not we're internally, freaking out a little bit, to see that as a gift, and and when we get a gift, it's a present. And being present is really important for our kids. And that's a big part of this whole process. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak.
Stephanie?
Yeah, I think Anya said it really well. One is I want to thank the opportunity to speak today. And I'm really glad that so pleased to present with Anya, and all their knowledge around and experience, I think, was exceptionally helpful. I think the last sort of word that I want to leave with is, one, I know we didn't get to the other video. I do really encourage people to check out that very long presentation around intersectionality. But it's about supporting our gender diverse autistic youth. And I guess the last thing I want to leave people with is you're here. So, and that's support. So really, thank you for showing up. Just thanks for showing up. It says a lot for the kids you love and are supporting.
This is exactly it. Looking for information. Now I got like 2 or 3 jobs here. They're not all that important. You guys do all the heavy lifting, but I missed one. I know it doesn't make sense, but I still want to read it because I feel bad. Did not do the land acknowledgement off the top. Anya did a good job of helping me out, but we offer our gratitude to the First Peoples across Turtle Island and their care of and teachings about the land, the water, the animals, and our relations. We recognize our role in taking action personally and collectively to acknowledge and challenge the impacts of colonization, which we continue to benefit from. Guys, great conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. Make sure everybody you check out the resources, take the survey, tell your friends, and we will see you at our next Autism Ontario event.
Thank you.